Okay, so. All right, no worries, that happens. We'll start again. So, thank you everyone here in Marseille for joining us, and for those online, thank you very much. You've heard this before, so I'll switch directly to the video, and I hope this time you see it online. Okay for everyone online? Yes, great. So, what you've just experienced through this video is how a different sound environment can influence how you're feeling. We've experienced how a noisy environment can create a sense of anxiety, uncomfort, that will change your perception of the external world and make it uncomfortable. We've seen how just by changing the sound that was being played, we changed to a state of being okay, not so uncomfortable, just by having some more pleasant music. And you can imagine that you can switch from one state to another as we've sort of experienced, but for certain cases in sound-based pathologies, you can stay stuck in the second part. Some of these pathologies can be tinnitus, hyperacusis, misophonia, or even hearing loss. They are going to influence how you perceive your sound environment. But then the question is, once you've reached this state of uncomfort, it's a subjective feeling, right? So how can you assess how the subject is feeling? It's not something objective that is easy to measure. So what we're going to be talking about today is how we can try to assess the subjective perception of uncomfort due to sound. So a quick outline of the presentation. We'll be talking about this question through three main topics. First of all, hyperacusis and the first study that is linked to it. And then we will switch to also misophonia, and then I'll finish up with a preliminary study on hearing aids. And then we'll have the discussion together. So let's start with hyperacusis. So what's hyperacusis? Hyperacusis is a condition where everyday sounds are perceived as more uncomfortable, louder than normal, and creating a state of suffering. So as you can see, even moderate, intense sounds, for example, people speaking, or even music can generate uncomfort. Now, this general definition of hyperacusis can contain a lot of different elements. Actually, there might be different online. Cut your microphones, please. Thank you. There are different subparts of this definition that can exist. And some have been identified, maybe 4 main global ones by Tyler and collaborators. And these sub-definitions of hyperacusis can exist one by themselves or in combination in different proportions. First one is loudness hyperacusis. It's usually the one that is most discussed, where basically it's really a problem of loudness. So sounds are perceived as louder than normal. Even moderately intense sounds are perceived as louder than normal. Then there's annoyance hyperacusis, where specific sounds can be unpleasant. A subpart of this could be associated to misophonia, as we'll see later, where also specific sounds are unpleasant. Then there is fear hyperacusis, also known as phonophobia, where there is an avoidance behavior linked to sound. This can be generated after, for example, a trauma or so on. And then there's pain hyperacusis, where sound can trigger or aggravate pain symptoms in or around the ear. So as I said, the main one is loudness hyperacusis, is the most discussed about. So then, if we want to talk about loudness hyperacusis, then what is loudness? Loudness is basically how you perceive sound, and you can give it a rating on a loudness scale from something to very soft all the way to extremely loud. So it's based on how you perceive the external stimulus. Now, if we are to have a basic schematic of what loudness looks like, you could have that with an increase of intensity. I'll take my pointer so people online can see. So with an increase of intensity, you'll start with a very soft sound and then increase to a level where sound is extremely uncomfortable. And this level can also be discussed as the loudness discomfort level, so where sounds are so loud that they become uncomfortable. So in a normal situation, you have this normal loudness growth curve. But in hyperacusis, what happens is that you have this slope of the loudness growth curve that is increased, which means that for these intensities here, you'll see that the loudness is larger than normal, leading to the point where this loudness discomfort level will be reached for levels that are lower than normal, as you can see here. So hyperacusis can happen without hearing loss, as you can see on the left, but also with hearing loss. In the case of hearing loss, well, you'll just start hearing sounds at a higher level, but the slope, again, will be very much increased and still leading to a point where the loudness discomfort level is lower than normal. Now, this should not be confused with loudness recruitment, which is the dotted line situation here, where, again, you start hearing sounds later at higher intensities, right? But you reach a loudness discomfort level that is still normal. So also an increased slope, but a normal loudness discomfort level. So you can assess these loudness changes in subjects with what are called loudness growth curves. So here's an example. Basically what you do is that you present a sound, usually an artificial sound, so pure tone or noise, in increasing intensity, and then you ask the subject, okay, tell me when you think you've reached the level that the sound is soft, or comfortable, or loud, or too loud. And then there are different ways to estimate this. Here's another example as well from Hebert and collaborators where they used a different scale, this time 7 categories. But the problem with these methods is that it's very much influenced by the bottom and the top part of the scale. These serve basically as anchor points that subjects are going to use to base their ratings upon. So as you can imagine, just depending how you define this too loud part will definitely influence how the scale is going to look like, right? What is too loud? How can you perceive what is too loud, and how do you explain it to the subject? So you have these 2 anchor points, which will lead to more variability in the middle of your scale. And then there's another thing as well, is that basically when you analyze the results, they separate these categories in categories that are equally distant. So in the sense where a step of loudness from very soft to soft would be equivalent to a step of very loud to too loud, but that's not necessarily the case. Now, if we have a look a bit more into detail where we start seeing these differences between these populations where there was some hyperacusis, you'll see that actually the differences occur mostly as of roughly 60 dB SPL and higher, so more moderate to intense levels. And keep this in mind as we'll be using it later on. Okay, so how do we diagnose hyperacusis? So I've discussed about these loudness growth curves, but there are also other methods that are used. There's no real consensus on a gold standard measure of hyperacusis, but in this review, they've identified the methods that are most used in clinics. One way to do this is through an interview, a self-report. So you ask the subject, okay, how do you feel with sounds being too loud, too unpleasant, and how does it affect you? Then the subject may give you an answer. Oh, yes, it affects me a little, yes, or a lot. But then the question is, well, it's not black or white, right? So where do you draw the line to say, oh, yes, we've reached the diagnosis of hyperacusis? Then there are also questionnaires. The most used one is the hyperacusis questionnaire, the HQ. Again, here, there's no consensus on the cutoff value to be used. And then psychoacoustically, we talked about these loudness growth curves, but then what is usually done in clinics, as it's faster, you're just going to estimate the last part, so this too loud part of the scale. And these are the loudness discomfort levels. Why? Because it's actually just faster to do. You don't have to take the time to estimate each point. Now, the problem with these loudness discomfort levels, there are many, so I'll discuss some of them with you. There's a lot of variability between subjects, so you can have some hyperacusis subjects that will have high LDLs, and inversely, some people with no complaints of hyperacusis, but low LDLs. There's an influence on the instructions. So depending how the experimenter is going to define what too loud is, what this LDL level is, will influence how the subject will define this level to himself. And it's been shown that just changing how you word it will influence the results. It doesn't always reflect the complaint, so it doesn't always correlate with measures of self-report or with questionnaires. And importantly, for severe cases of hyperacusis, it can generate a lot of uncomfort, even to the case for severe hyperacusis, where it can generate symptoms that are going to increase and that are going to last for 1 to 3 days or so. And so much so that actually these subjects will have an avoidance behavior with this experiment, where they will say, oh yes, I've reached my uncomfort level before actually reaching it, in a way to protect them from the symptoms that will occur. So there's a bias here with this. And with all this, there's still no consensus neither on a cutoff to be used, with values that can range from 70 to 90 dBHL. So enough motivation to find a new method. Now, last thing I'd like to add on these LDLs is that, interestingly, here, for example, in this study, they tested over 380 hyperacusic subjects. They were identified based on their complaint and their symptoms, and they assessed LDLs at different frequencies. And as you can see, the distribution is very large. So there's this big variability that I've discussed earlier. Another thing I want to add here is that, as you can see, generally, these LDLs are quite flat across the different frequencies. So what does this mean? This means that maybe differences in the complaints of different sounds as being perceived as more unpleasant or uncomfortable are not necessarily linked to the frequency content, but maybe to other things, maybe spectrotemporal characteristics, or even what the sound is, what its meaning is, how the people relate to this sound. And we'll discuss this more later. So in study 1, what we wanted to do was, well, explore some of these spectrotemporal characteristics of sound, but not necessarily artificially, as you would do in a lab, but more so with using sounds that are out there, right? Subjects complain of everyday sounds, so let's use everyday sounds to assess their complaint. So we created a database of sounds, birds singing, cars driving by, and so on. We asked feedback from some hyperacusics. We said, okay, what sounds do you find particularly unpleasant in your day-to-day lives? What would you add to this database? And we ended up on a consensus of 69 sounds. But now what? What do you do with this? We have our sounds, but what do you want to assess, and how do you want to assess it? Let's come back to the complaint of these hyperacusics. They complain that these increased sound perception or this altered sound environment will have an impact on their quality of life, will create suffering, right? In the sense that they cannot even participate in tasks or events that they used to, like going to the restaurant or meeting friends or even doing the dishes. So in this sense, they have a different relationship with the sound environment. And how do they complain of this? They say, oh, sounds are too loud, they're unpleasant, they're painful. So one of these complaints is that sounds are too loud, right? And this is what we've been talking about with these loudness growth curves. You can estimate this loudness. But is hyperacusis just based on loudness? We don't think so. We think that hyperacusis may have loudness maybe at its core for certain subjects. It will have definitely an influence on how sounds are perceived, but there are other elements that will tend to create this suffering situation. You will have these unpleasant, painful complaints and this reduced quality of life. So if we want to assess hyperacusis, then we should not only assess loudness, but also try to assess what comes with it. So how do we want to assess it? How did we go about with this? So we wanted, as I said, something relevant to their complaint, right? That captures the whole sort of concept that is hyperacusis. We want a method and a measure that is simple, intuitive, easy to understand for a subject. For loudness, for example, it's not always easy for a subject to say, oh yes, I think I've reached what I define as comfortable, or I think I've reached what is too loud. What is too loud? How do you explain it to the subject? It's not always very intuitive. And we want a method that is quite fast, in the sense that we want to create a tool that can be used easily, both in research but also clinically. So, for example, these loudness growth curves, it can take some time to estimate each dot precisely. So what we came up with was this pleasant to unpleasant visual analog scale. We think that it captures both something that is easy to understand, right? It's quite easy to understand what pleasant and unpleasant is. We're not asking something too complicated to the subject. And it will capture both a bit of the loudness factors, but also the lived experience that comes with the sounds that are experienced, right? So we use the scale to measure how subjects react to the sounds in our database. We've tested 4 different levels: 60, 70, 80, and 90 dB SPL. Now remember, these are the levels that I've shown in the loudness growth curves, where you start seeing these differences. But then you might be thinking, well, you're testing hyperacusics at 80 and 90 dB SPL. That's quite high, right? I've just said that these LDLs, they create too much discomfort, and we want to avoid that. So we have 2 methods that we put in place to avoid too much discomfort. First of all, we had subjects with a circuit breaker, so it's a simple switch. They could stop the sound at any given moment, right? So this reduced a bit their sense of anxiety towards the experiment. So if a sound would start and they knew it was already max unpleasantness, it's no use to listen to the whole of it, so they could stop it. And secondly, we had an algorithm in the task which prevented sounds rated as very unpleasant already at a given level, so let's say 70 dBHL, to be presented again at higher levels, because we know they'll be rated at the max level again at these higher levels. Okay, so here are the sounds that we've tested. I'll take a quick break. Okay, so here are the sounds that we've tested. So as you see, there are a lot of unpleasant sounds. This came from our hypothesis we had at the beginning, that basically, if there are specific characteristics in sound that may generate differences in how sounds are perceived, right? These rattling of dishes, for example, that subjects complain a lot, then we could maybe detect this unpleasantness already at low levels. So then we don't have to test much higher. That's why we add a lot of these unpleasant sounds. So here's one example. It's a fork scratching a plate, one of my favorites. And then we also have different instruments for the pleasant sounds. The idea of adding pleasant sounds was to counterbalance these unpleasant sounds. See how people react to these. Here's another example. And then we added some artificial sounds, as these are sounds that are used in LDL measurements, right? Pure tones and noises. We want to see how they rate these. Here's one example of a pure tone of 500 hertz. Okay, so we have these sounds. Now let's start looking at the results. So we can first have a look at the raw kind of results. So here's the median rating for control groups. For the control group, so you have ratings that go from 0, being pleasant, all the way to 100, being unpleasant. And here we're at 60 dB. And what do we see? Well, we see what we've expected, that basically unpleasant sounds are rated as unpleasant, the top part, and pleasant sounds are rated as pleasant, right? If we have a look what happens in the hyperacusics, same thing. Unpleasant sounds are unpleasant, pleasant sounds are pleasant, or at least less unpleasant. But then if we're interested, for example, we look at the top 20 sounds. We say, okay, what are the 20 most unpleasant sounds in controls? And we compare them to the top 20 sounds of hyperacusics. You'll see that 85% of the sounds rated as most unpleasant in controls are also rated as most unpleasant in these hyperacusics. So it's interesting. It shows that they share basically what unpleasant sounds are, right? There doesn't seem to be specific sounds that might pop out or they might be different from the control group. So let's keep on looking to differences between these two groups. So what you can do is plot the ratings from the control group against the hyperacusis group. Each dot here is a sound. And as you'll see, if you have a dot that is above this diagonal, it means that the rating is higher for the hyperacusics, right? So what do we see? Here we're at 60 dB. We see that we have the unpleasant sounds that are quite similar between both groups, okay? And these overlap with artificial sounds that are quite similar between both groups. Interestingly, this means that artificial sounds are considered as unpleasant for both groups, or are not necessarily always something as neutral, right? And then the biggest difference really appears with these pleasant sounds that you can see here. And this pattern kind of stays when we increase in intensity. So 70, 80, and 90 dBSPL. And statistically, that's what we see as well. It's the median group rating of pleasant sounds that shows a difference between both groups, but not unpleasant or artificial sounds. So that's already a first interesting observation, that unpleasant sounds are not necessarily more unpleasant, right? Maybe they are, but not so much. But where you see the biggest difference is in these pleasant sounds. Pleasant sounds are not experienced as being very pleasant anymore. So we have this general observation. Now, the next step was, well, we want to create a new tool. To do so, we want to avoid testing sounds that don't give much information, right? These sounds that don't show differences, we're not going to use them. So let's go down to a smaller amount of sounds. So how do we do this? First, we can have a look at the discriminant power of each sound. Here we use the effect size. And as you'll see, then we have these pleasant sounds that show the biggest differences between our two groups, right? But then the question is, how many sounds do you want to keep, and what combination of sounds do you want to keep? So to answer this question, we first had to create some sort of score that could kind of resume how subjects react to these sounds, rate these sounds. So to do this, we first had a look at the ratings, all right? And as you can see, if we take these three sounds as examples, you have your control group here, distribution, and then you have one hyperacusis subject as an example here in dotted red. Now, what I've said in the definition of hyperacusis is that sounds are experienced as louder, more uncomfortable than normal, right? So let's create a score that can estimate how higher these ratings are compared to normal. So what you can do is you can, for example, for a given sound, evaluate the distance between the rating and the control population or sample. You can do this for each of the sounds you've selected. If you average these distances at 60 dB, you'll have a score at 60 dB. You can have a score at 70 if you average these distances, or at 80 for these distances. And then if you want a general score, you just average all these distances together. Now here we did not keep the 90 dB SPL ratings because of saturation we've seen in the ratings, and also because it's a really high level and you don't want to be testing so high for hyperacusics. So these scores, we call them the CDS scores, CDS being core discriminant sounds. So basically the sounds that you found are the most useful, the selection of sounds you've kept that are the most effective at separating your two groups. So we have the score. Now let's test the different possibilities and keep the combination which is best. So what we did is that we zoomed in to these 15 most discriminant sounds here, and then we tried every combination of sounds within these. So every combination of one sound, every combination of two sounds, of three sounds, and so on until 15, which is roughly 32,000 different combinations. And each time we assessed the accuracy of the resulting score in separating subjects with and without a complaint of hyperacusis. And we see that we have a peak of accuracy here at 7 sounds. Now, what 7 sounds are they? These ones. So you have laugh, underwater, birds, fountain, harp, ocean, and piano. So as you can see, they're all pleasant sounds, right? And then you can have a look a bit at their distribution between the groups. And then what's interesting with these scores is that after you can have a look more into depth, one subject at a time, how they react to sound. So for example, this hyperacusis subject here in dotted red, you'll see if you have a look at his scores here, you have score at 60, 70, and 80. You'll see he has scores above cutoff values that we were able to determine in our analysis, in our rock analysis, and also a global score here that you can use. Okay, so we have these 7 sounds. Now, the first question we had was, well, what do these sounds have in common? Why are they the most discriminant between our two groups? So we thought, okay, let's have a look at the spectrotemporal characteristics of these. And as you can see, there doesn't seem to be anything that is really shared between all 7 of them. You have some noisy sounds, here example, ocean fountain. You have some low frequencies, like underwater, some higher frequencies in birds, some cicadas here and laugh, and then also some harmonic sounds like harp and piano. Then what we want to do was, let's compare the accuracy of our new measure, our method, with existing measures. So in the experiment, we also assessed the hyperacusis questionnaire and LDLs. And if you have a look at the accuracy here, well, you have an accuracy that is slightly above, but if you look at the confidence intervals, you'll see there's actually overlapping with the other methods. So we can't say that our method is better, and that's not the goal. We can at least say that our method shows accuracy results that are at least the same as existing methods. So if it's at least as good as other methods, then it could be used as a novel alternative, right? And for us, we think it could be definitely used as an alternative to LDLs, the other psychoacoustic method here. Another thing I want to show you is that if you have a look at the CDS scores at 60 dB here, you'll see that, well, the accuracy here is already pretty good. So what does this mean? This means that already at 60 dB, you have information, assessment, and diagnostic information for hyperacusis. You don't have to go too high to reach this information. We don't have to go all the way to uncomfort. Okay, let's wrap up a bit this first study. So what we've shown was that these pleasant sounds are where we see the highest difference between our both groups, but that these unpleasant sounds or artificial sounds are not necessarily more unpleasant than controls. Then we've created a new tool, right, where we want to get closer to the complaint of subjects. We're using everyday sounds to assess their complaint of everyday sounds. With our VS, we're capturing both some loudness components, but also some suffering that can be associated to it. We can have, as I said, diagnostic information already at 60 dB. You don't have to go too high. It's not too uncomfortable in the sense that these sounds are actually quite pleasant, right? Maybe not pleasant for hyperacusics, but, or at least less unpleasant, right? And if you compare them to ratings of artificial sounds, you'll see that they're all rated as less unpleasant than pure tones or noises, for example. So we don't generate too much uncomfort. It's pretty fast to do. We only have 7 sounds. And if we test the 3 intensities, maybe add 3 repetitions per sound, that takes roughly 10 minutes to assess. And we have an accuracy that is at least equivalent to existing methods. So if we come back here to our painting, what we've assessed with our method is basically how the subject could tell us through the method that for hyperacusis, sounds aren't very pleasant anymore, right? It's not necessarily unpleasant sounds that are more unpleasant, but it's really that they lost the possibility to enjoy sounds as being very pleasant. Okay, now let's move on to misophonia. Okay, so for misophonia, I'll start with a small introduction to show the difference between loudness, hyperacusis, and misophonia. If we are to have a visual analogy of this, loudness hyperacusis is basically that sounds are too much, they're too loud, too uncomfortable. So for an image, it would be something too bright, too powerful. But in the case of misophonia, it's actually what the sound represents. It's the specificity of the sound, what it means. So if we are to take an image of this, this might be a good example, right? So you have this feeling of disgust. Ugh, what is this, right? So that's what misophonia is, but for sounds. They have this disgust, this irritation towards these sounds. And what sounds? It's actually very specific. They're human-generated sounds. And one of the most sounds that is complained of is the sound of chewing. Now, you might all find chewing sounds quite uncomfortable, right? It's not something that we really enjoy. But for misophonics, it's not just uncomfortable. It also triggers something else. It triggers an arousal response. So they'll start feeling heart rate increase. They'll start sweating, as can be measured through skin conductance, for example. So there's a heightened level of stress here. And this is a sort of type of fight or flight response that they have to these sounds. So they might confront the person making the sound, or they might try to flee the scene where the person is making the sound. And this is what really makes misophonia condition. So there's not only chewing sounds, there are other sounds. These sounds are called triggers, misophonia triggers. Here are some examples. I've discussed about eating sounds, but there are also breathing, nose sounds, different finger sounds like tapping, and so on. Here are some other examples. For example, in these eating sounds, again, biting an apple, cracking of crisps, swallowing. For nasal breathing sounds, breathing, snoring, nostril sounds, right? Throat sounds, cleaning the throat. And then you have all these repetitive sounds like tapping of fingers, keyboard typing, pen clicking. All these can create a trigger in these misophonics. Now, how do you diagnose misophonia at the moment? So some authors think that it's more related to a neuropsychological disorder. So actually they will be using clinical interviews to assess this. There are different guidelines that you can follow, like the latest ones from Jaeger and al. In 2020. Then there are different questionnaires, the misophonia questionnaire, the MisoQuest. These sounds will evaluate how the subject remembers. There's a you evaluate the recollection of subjects of their experience with these misophonia triggers. But there's no direct measure. There's no psychoacoustic method that exists. So that's where we step in. So what was our approach this time around? We went through an online task, not only because of COVID, but also because we saw it as an opportunity to say, okay, how well can we transfer our method to an online setting, so to a different setting? And why does this work for misophonia? Well, because for misophonia, it's really what the sound is, what it means, what it represents that's important. Not so much the loudness, right? So you'll first have the context, so what the sound means, that will influence the severity of misophonia. And then, of course, increased loudness will increase the severity. I mean, a louder chewing sound will be less unpleasant, right? But in loudness of hyperacusis, it's really loudness that will play a first role, that will really influence the severity, and then also context can play a role here. So we estimated these online, right? As we could not control so much of the intensity, but we can control the context or the information of sounds. We had them rated on a pleasant to unpleasant visual analog scale again. We tested over 250 subjects that took part in the experiment. And subjects, when they started the experiment, could set the comfort level that they wanted to use for the rest of the experiment. So each had their own comfort level for the test. So here are the results. The sounds that we used. So we used some misophonic trigger sounds based on the literature, and we used some that we've recorded previously, like chewings, for example, slurping, and some other sounds. But then we also added some unpleasant and pleasant sounds. We did this because, well, we know that misophonia is very specific to these sounds, right? But does misophonia maybe change how you perceive the sound environment, in the sense that maybe other sounds will be also rated as more unpleasant, right? So we wanted to verify this by using these unpleasant and pleasant sounds that we know are unpleasant and pleasant based on results from the first study. So let's look at the ratings. What do we have? Again, we can plot the difference between both groups, and it's quite evident here. You'll see that the misophonics group really have a higher rating than controls, right? It's really specific to these sounds. And interestingly, these pleasant and unpleasant sounds really don't show any differences. So it's really the specificity that, again, is shown through these ratings. If we have a look more into detail here in the distributions, unpleasant, pleasant sounds overlap, and then you have our misophonic sounds here. Now, our misophonic sounds, we wanted to separate them in different subcategories. Mouth, breathing, nose, throat, and repetitive. This was based on what we've seen in the literature, these categories that have been discussed, but also based on the complaints that we've collected through the online task. So we have these subcategories, and now the next step is, again, like the first study, let's have these sounds and reduce them to a smaller amount of sounds, right? Optimal sounds. But we want to keep sounds within each of these categories, as they could be used as possible subtyping tools in the future. So how do we do this? Again, we created a CDS score with the same method as before, right? And then within each subcategory, we were able to try every combination of sounds. So every combination of one sound, every combination of two sounds, and the last combination of three sounds. Then you can plot the accuracy for each of these combinations, and we see that for the mouth sounds, it's keeping the three sounds that yields the highest classification accuracy. You can do the same thing for each of these subcategories, and you can have the highest accuracy for each. Now here, for breathing no sounds, we kept the three sounds, as there was a secondary measure we used, the AUC under the rock curve, that showed a higher score. So we have these final sounds, the CDS of misophonia, 10 sounds, keeping these four main subcategories. So you have chewing sounds, slurping, and so on, and some repetitive sounds too. Now then, again, you can look at individual ratings. So for example, the hyperacusis subject here in dotted red, you'll see he has quite high ratings in these categories, but not so much in the repetitive sounds. And this is shown also in their scores, right? You can have a score for each subcategory. And again, you can compare them to a cutoff value that we were able to assess through our ROC analysis. And as you can see, this subject, doesn't react so much to these repetitive sounds. So that's an information, supplementary information that you can have on the subject, right? And then, of course, you have these total scores as well. Okay, performance-wise, if we are to compare how well they separated our control from misophonics in this study, the total score performed relatively well. And then we have each of the subscores here. And as you'll see, the mouth sound performs best. This makes sense as it is the sound that is the most complained of by misophonics, right? And then if you want to try and have a look a bit of this possible subtyping that we can do with these scores, you'll see here that most subjects are above the cutoff value for each of these subcategories, right? But then there are also some who complain of these three first ones, but not of repetitive sounds, as the example I've shown before. So maybe there's some more information that we can collect with these subscores. Let's conclude a bit on this second study. So what did we show? We showed the specificity to triggers, right? That's what we expected, but we also were able to measure it even at comfortable levels. So again, it shows that it's specific to the context, the meaning of the sound, and not so much on the loudness. We have a new tool that we can use for misophonia. And most importantly, it's a direct measure, right? It's not like questionnaires where you're assessing a recollection of how they experience these sounds. You test them with the sound and you can measure directly their response. We may be able to do some subtyping in the future with these subscores. And we effectively transferred the methodology that we've designed in the first study to another condition, another sound-based pathology, misophonia, and to another setting online. So if we come back here to the painting, what we've assessed is that these specific sounds are horrible, right? Okay, so before moving on to the next chapter, actually I have good news. 2 days ago, we got the notification that the publication for the study was accepted in Scientific Reports. So we're happy about that. All right, next chapter. Let's keep on going. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a preliminary study we did on hearing aids. Here again, how you perceive the sound environment has changed. So let's see if we can measure it with our method as well. So what happens when you have hearing aids? Normally you have a broken ear, right? Which will change how you perceive sound. You'll receive less information, you'll perceive less sound, and you want to try and repair this by adding a hearing aid between the ear and the brain, and this will restore some sound perception that was lost. It will never be the same sound perception that it was before, right? Because you have this artificial equipment that will process sound for you. And this processing of sound may distort the sound. And the thing is that often when hearing aid practitioners fit hearing aids, they will first concentrate on, okay, how well can you hear others speak, right? But they will not always necessarily have a look at how other sounds are transformed by this hearing aid. Actually, one of the reasons why subjects don't wear the hearing aids anymore is because everyday sounds are too loud, too noisy. So they'll stop using it. So maybe if we can have a tool that can assess how sounds are unpleasant, then we can maybe lead to a better hearing aid fitting. So I'd like to thank Aline Jalabert, who was a student that worked with us, who collected the data I'm going to present and analyzed the first preliminary results. So thank you very much, Aline. What she did is that we tested 4 different groups. First 3 groups had hearing aids for different reasons, presbyacusis, asymmetrical hearing loss, or tinnitus. For group 3, it's because the tinnitus, the hearing aids were mostly used for tinnitus management. That was a priority. And then a group of controls here. Now, one thing I want to add for these hearing aid groups is that they had already been fitted at least 6 months prior to the measurements. So they are already, in a way, used a little bit to their hearing aids. And one thing I'd like to add quickly is that, as you can see, the mean age here is quite higher for the hearing aid groups compared to the normal ones. So actually what we're doing now is that we're collecting more data on a separate group of controls with higher ages so that we can compare results a bit better. So what did we measure? We measured the LDLs as well to measure if there was any signs of hyperacusis. We did both in 2 ways. First way we did with headphones, so hearing aids off, headphones on, measured LDLs. And then we also measured them with the hearing aids on through loudspeakers. If we compare the average group ratings here, you'll see that if we are to consider like a cutoff value at 77 dBHL, which is the criterion by Ash and Moore in 2017 that we've used in the first study, if we are to use this cutoff, we'll see that generally there doesn't seem to be any severe hyperacusis in the groups, on average, right? We also had the MASH questionnaire that can estimate hyperacusis. What it does is that it has different activities, and you rate how annoying these activities are because of your hyperacusis. And if you have a look at the global scores here, the mean scores for each group, you'll see that we only had a significant difference between the tinnitus and control group here. But if you have a look at the range of ratings of the MASH score, basically they define that you have moderate hyperacusis as of a score of 3, which is just about reached here by the tinnitus group. So there doesn't seem to be any severe hyperacusis in our groups. So here are the ratings, the sounds that we've used. We did it with subjects with their hearing aids on through some loudspeakers. We have the CDS of hyperacusis here, burrs, harp, and so on. And then some unpleasant sounds. And we also added some sounds that are specific to subjects having hearing aids that they complain a lot, paper compaction, for example, or plastic bag. So let's have a look at the ratings. So if we are to compare the control group here, so group 4, so the control group from this study, with the first group, which was the presbyacusis group, you'll see, well, unpleasant sounds, this is 60 dB, sorry. The unpleasant sounds are quite similar between both groups, but the CDS, you start seeing bigger differences. If you increase the intensity, you'll see this as well. And then if you compare the next group, asymmetrical hearing loss, you'll see roughly the same pattern over these intensities. And then the last group, the tinnitus group, which seems to have a slightly higher ratings than the other 2 groups. So interesting, right? That these unpleasant sounds are not necessarily more unpleasant, but again, we see these differences in these pleasant sounds. So pleasant sounds are not experienced really as pleasant anymore. Now, if we zoom in a bit more into the CDS, you'll see there's 2 patterns, at least at 60 dB. You have these 4 sounds, which show bigger differences, and you have these 3 sounds, well, they're actually quite similar between both groups. If we have a look at these 4 sounds, actually 3 of them are water sounds. So you had ocean, fountain, and underwater, and then there's laugh as well. what you could hypothesize is that basically these hearing aids might distort these sounds and lose the fine structure that will make them possible to identify these sounds as water sounds, right? So they lose maybe these elements that make them pleasant. But on the other hand, and what I want to add is that in these spectrotemporal characteristics we've seen at the start, these water sounds are actually quite noisy. So you can see that they can shift from something quite pleasant to noisy quite easily if you lose some of these fine elements. And then here we have the harmonic sounds. So we have harp, piano, and birds. As you can see, at 60 dB, it's quite okay. But then at 70 dB, it's these three sounds here. You see a real big jump in ratings. Here they really become unpleasant. So this might be due, it's a hypothesis, right, that because of the hearing aids, there's some distortion of sound and more at the higher levels. And this could be due to compressive gain, for example, that will distort these sounds and prevent them from being pleasant. So we've had a look here at group ratings, but I think it will be very much interesting in the future to have a look more into individual ratings, because here we'll have more information as well, and how we can use this information to change the hearing aid fitting to adapt it through time for these subjects. So as I said at the start, we did not see any major differences, major signs of hyperacusis through the LDLs or through the MASH score. But here we have higher ratings. So what does this mean? This means that with our method, we might have measured something that was missed with the other methods, and we've detected an increased unpleasantness of these sounds. So we have an information that we did not have before. Now, if we use this information, if hearing aid practitioners, for example, use this information, then it could lead to a better fit in the end. Now, what you consider usually in hearing aid practice is that you'll have, while you do the first fit of the hearing aid, you'll have a lot of unpleasantness in the start, right? Because sounds are too much. And the hearing aid practitioner might say, well, you'll get used to it. It will stop with time. You'll get used to it. It'll be comfortable. And then you can hear sounds all right. But actually what we've measured is that, there might be some sort of lingering unpleasantness that stays with time, right? These subjects had hearing aids at least 6 months already, but they still had unpleasantness. So we measured something, and we hope that we can do something with it now that we know it's here. So what we've did here with these subjects is that we noticed that sounds are unpleasantly distorted, right? They lose some of the structures they make them pleasant, sorry. And again, these unpleasant sounds didn't show much more unpleasantness. Okay, to wrap up, and to start the discussion a little bit, one of the major drawbacks, but also strengths of our method is that we're only using one VAS, right? We're measuring only one VAS from pleasant to unpleasant. Now you might think, well, this rating can be influenced by many things, right? We've talked a bit about loudness and hyperacusis, for example, but there are other things that can influence the rating. Memory, emotions that they're feeling at the time, or associations that you make with the sound, personal associations with these sounds. But then the question is, well, okay, it seems that you're measuring a lot, but what happens in a daily situation, right? Every day when you experience sounds, there are several elements that are going to influence how you relate to these sounds, how you perceive them. All these elements in your daily life will influence how you find them pleasant or unpleasant. So in the end, we're quite close to what the lived experience is, right? We try to have a measure that is the most ecological as possible, because we're capturing all these elements at once. And importantly, we're doing it with everyday sounds, not with artificial sounds, for example, pure tones or noises, as done previously. So to conclude, what we've done is we had a look at different sound-based pathologies and how we could assess them with our method. We had a look at hyperacusis, at misophonia, at hearing aids as well, due to hearing loss. But there might be other conditions where we could use this method to assess their sound relation with sound, sorry. We could have a look at autism, for example, where it's known that they have an altered perception of sound, where sounds can be also too much, too loud, too uncomfortable. So we might have more information with these. We actually started a collaboration with an autism group as well. We could have a look at schizophrenia as well, for example, where in schizophrenia there's also an altered perception of the external world, right? And sound included. So we could possibly measure differences here of sound with our method. And I'm sure there are other avenues that we could explore using this method, and we'll see what happens in the future with that. So that's it. Thanks a lot. I'd like to thank the team here in Marseille, all of those that are here as well. Thanks for a great 3 years. It was fun. I'd like to thank not only the team of the lab, but the rest of the laboratory. It was fun hanging out with you as well. Thank you, Arno, of course, for a great 3 years. It was fun. And I'd like to thank the TINACT consortium within which I did my PhD. It was great to exchange with other people all over Europe on research projects. So yeah, thanks a lot. I'll be taking questions and discussions then. Thanks. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, I think that as president of this committee, I should introduce the discussion and then shut up and turn off my microphone. Thank you, Mr. Enzler, for this nice presentation, which was technically almost perfect, but ensuring that Zoom experience is quite good and not too stressing. Obviously, you were okay. I think that we had no time with the committee to decide who would speak in which order, but traditionally the reviewers speak first, and the reviewer who comes from the farthest place is Dave. So I think that Dave should start the discussion.
Thank you, Paul. I wonder if we could ask to stop sharing the screen so that we can see everybody, which we could. I'm delighted to be here, and clearly,
yes, I'll try.
Mr. Enzler, this is a substantial piece of work.
Great.
It's so encouraging that you spent 3 years looking at this in detail. I'm very excited to engage with you on this. Thank you very much for presenting it in English. I